Mysafiri ynë I parë njeriu me cilin do ta zhvillojmë intervistën e parë në emision sonte është ish-zëdhënësi I NATO-s, është një prej njerëzve që me paraqitjet e tij ka qenë jo vetëm burim informimi, ka qenë edhe burim shprese për kosovarët. Fjala është për Shea, të cilin besoj tani nëpërmjet një video lidhje do të duhej ta kishim live nga Brukseli. If so, Mr. Shea, if you can hear me, I'd like to welcome you to our show.
Very many thanks, Liv, for the invitation. Delighted to be with you today.
And we look back at March 24th as one of the more important dates in Kosovo history. How do you look back at it now, having in mind especially the current situation?
Well, I still look back on it with a certain degree of pride because I felt that compared with Bosnia, where NATO hesitated before intervening, set many red lines that it didn't really keep, and we had, as you know, 100,000 people killed and 2.5 million refugees and displaced people before finally NATO intervened in 1995. When it came to Kosovo, I really felt that NATO handled it a lot better. There was an attempt to negotiate at Rambouillet, but NATO made it clear that if the Serbs backed away from that agreement, which you remember that the Kosovo Albanians accepted, and if they went back, the Serbs went back to a campaign of repression, NATO would act. And on March the 24th, the Allies agreed to do so. Sometimes action is necessary. You have to be prepared to act. And so I felt that this time round we had a much better chance of intervening preventively and stopping massive violence in Kosovo, even if it was impossible to save the lives of everybody, of course.
And having in mind a recent sad event, I'd say the passing of Madeleine Albright, I would like you to maybe just give us an idea as to what her particular role was during this whole time in Rambouillet especially, and then as Secretary of State of US during the, let's say, negotiations and then the campaign itself.
Yes, well, like you, I was deeply affected yesterday by the news of Madeleine Albright's death. I knew her very well personally. She was a great inspiration for me, and I worked with her back in 2010 when she was the chairperson of a group of experts. I was also part of that group that prepared NATO's new strategic concept, which is still NATO's mission statement today. But of course, in the Kosovo years, she was a passionate believer in humanitarian intervention. She believed that NATO should not simply stay inside its borders after the end of the Cold War and wait to be attacked, but that NATO should use its military and political assets actively to stop genocide, to stop massive crimes against humanity, human rights violations in Europe. She believed in being very firm with dictators, whether they're called Putin, Milosevic, and she was the Pentagon, which sometimes was for what they thought were little wars, that the Pentagon and NATO more generally should be prepared to use force if necessary. And so she came, as you know, from Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
She was forced to flee to the United States because of the repression of the Nazis. She was deeply scarred by that experience, the experience of appeasement, of not standing up to dictators in the 1930s, which had produced the Second World War. And so I think her childhood really shaped her vision of life. But she was a great believer in liberal democracy, and may her soul rest in peace.
And you mentioned the new NATO mission statement, but let's get back to 1999. Would you say that it actually formed, the intervention in Yugoslavia, it shaped and it proved to the world what NATO is essentially there for?
Well, yes, certainly. It said that, you know, NATO is not only interested in its own security, it's interested in the security of its neighbours as well, even if they are not members of the alliance. And I think if you look at Ukraine today, yes, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but is NATO turning its back on Ukraine and leaving it defenceless in the face of Putin? Of course not. You see that there's a summit Today in Brussels, President Biden is in Europe for that. You see that NATO member states are giving lots of weapons to Ukraine, which are really helping the Ukrainians to fight back and defend themselves. You see that NATO members have imposed big sanctions on Putin and doing many things to keep Ukraine as a free and democratic state. So I think the Kosovo experience in '99, which is defending people who want to be European, who want to be free, and stopping repression, that I think also shaped the way in which NATO afterwards went to Afghanistan and tried to improve the life of the Afghans. Not always with the greatest results, it has to be admitted, but at least the effort was made, and the way in which NATO is standing up, as I said, in Ukraine today.
And on the other hand, having in mind exactly the situation in Ukraine, you mentioned the way NATO is helping Ukraine, but on the other hand, it has been said many times that the aspiration of Ukraine to join NATO or the plan of NATO expansion is one of the reasons that we have Putin doing what he's doing right now. Is Ukraine the border of NATO expansion at least today?
Well, I would say no, because you've seen over the last couple of years, you've seen Montenegro in your region join NATO. You've seen recently your neighbor to the south, North Macedonia, join NATO. Albania, of course, Croatia, Slovenia are already members of the alliance. So you've seen a big debate in Sweden and Finland over the last couple of weeks in the wake of Putin's invasion. And you've seen the Swedish leader and the Finnish leader say very clearly, even if we are not joining NATO immediately, we want the option, and we refuse a decision by Putin to take away from us the option of joining NATO if we so wish. It's the right of everybody. Now, it's true, obviously, that President Zelensky of Ukraine has suggested that perhaps this is not the best time for Ukraine to seek NATO membership, although he's still looking for Western international guarantees of Ukrainians' security. But I completely reject the views of some people that somehow NATO enlargement is responsible for the situation with Russia today, because I was at a meeting with Putin, personally at a meeting with Putin in Bucharest in 2008, when he said that Ukraine was not a real state. It was not a real country. It was an artificial country. It was part of Russia. So I think generally, Leon, that Putin sees NATO expansion simply as a pretext, simply as an excuse, a justification for the fact that he has never accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine in the first place.
And knowing Putin personally as you do, and having been in international diplomatic circles for so long, how real is the threat of potential use of nuclear weapons, or how close are we, or are we in a brink of a potential nuclear war?
Well, my sense at the moment is that Putin is trying to frighten us and intimidate us. You know, he's doing what every dictator does, which is, you know, to try to scare, to try to bully, to try to prevent us, dissuade us from reacting vigorously to his aggression. And Putin has been doing this for years. You know, he even went to a Boy Scout camp in Russia a couple of years ago, a Boy Scout camp, and devoted his speech to gesticulating with Russian nuclear weapons. So I think it's bravado. I think NATO should stay calm, to react calmly as NATO has done. That said, there are worries that Putin could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. He's used chemical weapons in my country, the United Kingdom, twice over the last few years. He's used chemical weapons against Alexei Navalny, his political opponent. He has encouraged the Syrian regime of Assad to use chemical weapons. So I do think that that is a real threat. On the other hand, also, you know, Putin lives in an isolated fantasy world. That's clear. And if he fears that he is losing in Ukraine, that the Russian army is being humiliated, that this politically for him is going to be an enormous defeat and setback, who knows what he could do?
Is he losing in Ukraine?
So,
is he being humiliated?
well, after the first month, you have to say yes, because the Russians have not achieved any of their strategic objectives. They've captured so far just one city. The plan was to be in Kiev in 24 hours. Putin, I think, was told by his intelligence service, the SRB, that Russia would be greeted with open arms by Ukrainians, including the Russian speakers, who would be happy to be liberated by Russia. And of course, this is not true. The various NATO sources calculate that the Russians have lost between 8 to perhaps 15,000 soldiers dead, the same number as in 10 years in Afghanistan, maybe 30 to 40,000 wounded, 2,000 tanks and a lot of military equipment. 1/10 of their army has been destroyed so far. So this is not exactly the definition of a success. But yes, we have to be sober here. Russia still has considerable military force, and the danger, as you know, Leon, is that a desperate Putin who feels that he's being pushed into a corner may sort of lash out by using force, particularly against civilian targets, as we see with the bombardment of Mariupol at the moment.
On the other hand, you mentioned Finland and Sweden. We've had a major policy shift in Germany with their government committing much more money to their defense budget and changing maybe the overall doctrine, at least according to some interpretations of their defense. Are we looking at a new era of the way the militaries in Europe are organized and structured?
Well, I think we are, because clearly defense is now going to be a much higher priority. Before, defense was largely about intervening in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, or in Libya, fighting jihadism, for example, in Africa or Afghanistan, dealing with human rights abuses, as in Kosovo. We called it counterinsurgency, we called it stabilization, we called it peacekeeping. But now armies have to go back to their traditional role, which is defend borders against major adversaries. And you see this today in Brussels at NATO in the debate about increasing NATO's presence in Estonia, in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, and so on. That means bigger armies with bigger budgets. That's clear. And the signal that Germany has sent is very encouraging in that respect. So yes, just like we have to unfortunately pay a higher price for our energy and a higher price for our food, we have to pay a higher price for our freedom as well these days, because we have authoritarian states like Russia, but there are others, China, Iran, North Korea, there are others who clearly believe that they can use military power to achieve their objectives, who are behaving more irresponsibly. And so, yes, I regret to say this, but the threat level to liberal democracy has gone up. And if we want to be free, we have to be, like Ukrainians, we have to be ready to defend our freedom.
So we're getting to a stage that we have older methods or more conventional methods of working against what we tend to call Western values. And I'd like to maybe just point out that maybe up to a few years ago, we've had a former US president, President Trump, who was even talking of disbanding NATO or appealing to European countries to invest more money because US cannot defend the whole world. Or we had French president talking about something that he calls European armed forces, which would be maybe outside of the scope of the NATO, but we've had maybe former Spanish PM, Jose Maria Aznar. I remember him talking about transforming NATO into an organization that would defend European countries from maybe cybercrime or terrorism. But we are back to conventional war, or so it seems.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, clearly Russia is a traditional type of adversary because the Russians have a very large army, 900,000 people. They have lots of tanks, they have lots of armored vehicles, they have lots of aircraft, the traditional things, and they're using this in Ukraine at the moment. But in addition, of course, they also have major electronic and they have major cyber capabilities. They are able to jam, for example, the GPS satellite signals that we need for our communications. And we've seen Russia operate so-called hybrid warfare tactics. For example, influence campaigns, disinformation and propaganda, trying to corrupt political parties through dirty money, all of these sort of influence campaigns. So they, on the one hand, are a traditional threat, but they're a new threat as well in the way in which they try to undermine democracies from within and push their narrative, their particular view of the world. So in a way, NATO has to sort of do 20th century and 21st century warfare at the same time. So yes, you're right, but there is also that change as well.
And getting back to maybe more regional issues, there's been talk and speculation, maybe even propaganda, as you mentioned, of possible implications of Ukraine conflict in the Balkans. Is there such a worry? Do you actually do you see anything that could sustain these claims?
Well, we have seen more Russian influence in the Balkans for some time already. Obviously, the strong link with Serbia, where we've seen some pro-Putin demonstrations in Belgrade in recent days. There aren't many places in Europe where you see pro-Russia demonstrations at the moment. And of course, strong links between the Russian military and Serbia, particularly providing, MiG fighters and military equipment and so on. Serbia also has a strong economic, but also security relationship with China, for instance, buying Chinese drones, that kind of thing. We've also seen Russia being quite influential in Bosnia, in particularly with Milorad Dodik and Republika Srpska, and Dodik making noises about independence for Republika Srpska, pulling away from Bosnia. The US has already put sanctions on him for that. We know that Russia has interfered in the elections in North Macedonia and, of course, in Montenegro a few years ago, as Montenegro was preparing to join NATO. So yes, there is now more foreign influence in the region. There is more competition. I think that the good thing is that NATO and the European Union have recognized that there's more competition. And you see now more engagement in the region. The German Foreign Minister, Baerbock, as you know, was recently in the region. She's appointed a special German envoy. The United States, the European Union are working more closely together, particularly, of course, in Kosovo with the talks with Belgrade and so on. So, and finally, the European Union, which seemed to be, getting cold feet a little bit on the prospect of enlargement of the EU to the Western Balkans, the EU is now sounding much more positive. So yes, there is more strategic competition, but I think the EU and NATO are, if I can use the expression, pushing back, fighting back, because they see that they need to do more to integrate the region into NATO, into the EU structures. Will fighting break out again? I don't think so, but certainly there are tensions, and those tensions, of course, are bad for the economy. They're also holding back the integration of the region. So we don't, but we need more diplomats, absolutely.
You mentioned Serbian ties with Russia. I would like to take this a bit further. I mentioned it in the intro that in Serbia there's a clear distinction between European integrations and Euro-Atlantic integrations, because they obviously do not aspire to join NATO in any way, although their military has participated in some NATO maneuvers. Is that in itself a threat to what we call regional security?
Well, Serbia is the largest country in demographic terms in the region. And of course, if you get one of the large countries in in the region, which is going in a different direction politically, but also, psychologically from the rest of the region, then it's going to hold the region back in general. And you're right that Serbia does not want to join NATO. I totally understand that. NATO and Serbia have a difficult relationship, and it will take time to overcome. Although, Leon, you're perfectly correct. This has not stopped Serbia from participating in the Partnership for Peace, in NATO exercises. We've had NATO has had a military liaison mission in Belgrade. But if Serbia wishes to join the European Union, and it's begun the accession negotiations, my view is it should start acting like a European Union state, showing that it shares European values, and therefore, not imposing the sanctions against Russia in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, along with the other EU members, and sort of wanting to be in the Russian camp and the EU camp, in the camp of the authoritarians and the camp of the Democrats at the same time. This is not what you expect of a country which aspires to join the European Union. So I think, yes, you're right about NATO, but I think that Serbia has to do more to really show that it wants to be part of the European family of nations, and that this is a marriage of love, not simply a marriage of convenience.
Another issue that's been talked about in Kosovo in recent days, maybe spurred by the situation in Ukraine, is the intensification of the efforts for Kosovo to join NATO. In some way, there's been talk of some maybe a change of procedures or some other way of NATO affiliation. Is that anyhow possible, or are we just still talking about the KFOR presence in here?
Well, my view on this is that definitely Kosovo should be a normal member of NATO's Partnership for Peace and have access to all of the menu of cooperative activities under the Partnership for Peace. And the fact that, I regret this, of course, from my own personal point of view, but the fact that there are 3 NATO countries that still don't recognize Kosovo for different reasons has often been used as a pretext to stop the full participation of Kosovo in NATO's partnership activities. So I hope, given the challenges in the Balkans that we were just talking about, NATO members will agree, despite this recognition issue, which unfortunately drags on, let's, do more to engage Kosovo in joint exercises, in cyber defense activities, in all of the things that NATO does and has to offer. And I hope that, NATO will, which started a few years ago, partnership activities with Kosovo. So we began those activities. I hope that NATO will now push ahead. I think it's in everybody's interest in the region. On the other hand, of course, KFOR is still there. KFOR is staying, and so to some degree, the protection from NATO, which Kosovo has enjoyed for 23 years since June 1999, when KFOR first entered, that protection continues, and I welcome that as well.
And it's been continuing for 23 years, and as such, it will probably continue up until Kosovo and Serbia reach what we call a comprehensive, legally binding agreement, which, judging by the rhetoric of leaders in Kosovo and in Serbia, is not anywhere near. Do you see this thing dragging itself for years to come, maybe? Is that something that's a potential threat?
Well, my sense that it will be solved over time. I mean, obviously, we've got the elections in Serbia in just a couple of days' time now. So Alexander Vučić, the president, he's on the campaign trail. So, don't expect any conciliatory rhetoric, of course, for the next few weeks. Elections are elections, as we well know. But once the elections are over, Vučić is the president. He's a strong political leader of Serbia. You've got, of course, with Prime Minister Kurti and President Osmani, you've got 2 strong leaders at the moment, I think, in Kosovo too. And strong leaders are the ones that make peace. because they are able to make difficult compromises, and they are able to sell those difficult compromises to their electorates and to win over the skeptics in the way, of course, that we saw recently in Macedonia. North Macedonia, the solution of the issue of the name with Greece, which many people said, hey, that's not going to happen. They'll never agree. So never say never. I think it is possible, but we just have to get the timing right. I mean, I think the Serbs understand that it's going to be very difficult for them to join the European Union if they don't solve the bilateral issue with Kosovo first. I think if you ask Serbs, is Kosovo now gone in the sense that it's not returning to Serbia, it's an independent country. They know very well that that's the particular case. You just need political leaders who have the courage and the vision to recognize reality and act on that political basis. The fact of the matter is that the United States and the European Union are now working actively, as you know, to push the talks forward. They had some success at the beginning. And so, I'm hopeful that eventually this issue is going to be resolved. But the European lever on Belgrade, I think, is going to be the decisive factor.
I said in the intro that you were once a hope for a nation entire. Now it's just a pleasure to talk to you and go through some of the happenings of 1999 and what the future holds for the region and Europe and NATO as well. Thank you very much.
It's always a massive pleasure for me, particularly on a day like today, to talk to you and through you to everybody in Kosovo. You're always in my thoughts, and good luck with all of the great progress that you're making since independence to becoming a true European nation and a great partner of NATO.
Thank you once more.